Nathan basically preached my sermon already. He didn't read my notes because he didn't find my notes, so I know he didn't cheat. But since they did all the work of lifting me up, I guess I'll preach the sermon, right? Fair? Okay. So I want to start by asking a question. What does it mean to be a person of God? Have you ever wondered about that? Like, in the Old Testament, it sometimes talks about people being a man after God's own heart. Like, David is a man after God's own heart. And we lift up other people with this kind of inflection and idea down through the line of the ages too, don't we? So I took 3 church history courses this year, and we get this kind of awe and wonder idea about all sorts of people in church history as well, right? Like Chrysostom and Augustine and Luther and Aquinas. And we haven't really stopped doing that today. Most people know the names of big name preachers and evangelists, and they get this kind of an air about them as well, right? Like Billy Graham is the obvious example, but whatever church tradition you come from, even if it's no church tradition, I'm sure there are names of people you would think of if I asked you to tell me someone who is a person of God, right? In our denomination, a lot of people would point to our founder, A.B. Simpson, the guy I talked about last month. He had a bunch of people around him who thought he was pretty awesome and thought he had really achieved on the whole man after God's own heart mission thing. And they even tried to give him an honorary doctorate at one point, although apparently he wasn't convinced about accepting it. Maybe that tells us something. On the other side of it, do you ever look at your life and feel like God must be out to get you? Like God's just setting you up for failure or luring you into a trap or tricking you into making the wrong move? Do you ever feel like God's love is true and real and important to share with others, but obviously, clearly, God's love doesn't apply to you? Maybe there are ways you were treated by your parents or your family that should never have happened, but nevertheless left you feeling the weight of your own deeply flawed unworthiness. Maybe you're thinking about a really important relationship in your life that sort of blew up horribly at some point, and you still don't quite know what went wrong with it. Maybe you might think about the way you got told that you not only don't belong, but can't possibly belong to God by the church for years and years because of something innately inside of you, like your gender identity or your sexuality, something that you had no control over. Maybe you have a disability. Maybe you've been told that if you had enough faith, then God would heal you. And you know, you have mustered every ounce of faith you and everyone else you know has or could ever have, but still, I don't know, you find yourself sitting in a wheelchair, unable to walk or unable to see or still having seizures. Like, I can't think of a person that would happen to, but like maybe. Or maybe you always thought you were okay, really. Nothing particularly bad has ever happened to you, but maybe you thought that being a person of God was supposed to feel more exciting, more enthralling, be more profound, or change more about the humdrum nature of life itself. And even if it had before the pandemic sort of shot that idea out the window. I don't know, but I do know that my daughter 10 and I spent the 6 weeks of Lent this year reading through the book of Psalms. And I think if any of those things feels like you, then it's pretty safe to say you are in good company. So our passage this morning comes from Psalm 90. Now, the book of Psalms is a book with 150 chapters. It's the longest book of the Bible. And each of these chapters is a psalm, a poem, or a song that is a prayer to God. Now, for generations, the Psalms have served as a prayer book for the people of God. First for the Jews, and then eventually the Christians sort of borrowed them and decided they were really good, so we kept them. And these prayers, like, they're kind of interesting, but they're not the kind of prayers that we pray here at Vox every week. They don't sound the same way. Some of them are full of amazement at how awesome and wonderful God is, and some of them are full of lament about how terrible and horrible life is, and all of them give us insight as to the nature of how people have thought about God and the ways they have felt about what happened in their lives over time. To the point where pretty much no matter what you're going through, you can find a psalm to pray that will capture most of the feelings that you have going on. Now, a lot of these psalms were attributed to King David, the man after God's own heart that we started out talking about, but some of them are also attributed to others, like this one that we're going to be talking about this morning, today, Psalm 90. It's attributed to Moses. In most translations of the Bible, just under where it says Psalm 90, it'll say a prayer of Moses, a man of God. Here's that language again. Just like David, Moses is deemed to be a man of God, a person of God. It's almost like he gets this special star beside his name. Now, maybe this isn't so surprising. Moses is a shared figure across 3 different world religions. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all consider him a prophet, so he clearly left his mark on the world. We got a brief glimpse into his life last week as he was part of God bringing the plagues against Egypt, but his life bears a little bit more of a reminder. So, Moses is born at a time when the Israelites were growing rapidly as a people and their slaves under Pharaoh in Egypt, and Pharaoh was getting a little worried about their existence, and so he orders that any boy born to a Hebrew woman is to be thrown into the Nile and drowned. So, like any mother, Moses' mother didn't like that idea very much. Can't think why. In fact, she simply could not bear it. And so she decides to hide him for 3 months. Now, I'm not really sure how she did this, like whether she tied him onto her stomach and pretended that he was, she was just pregnant for a really long time, hid him under her cloak. I'm not quite sure, but at some point, she stops being able to hide him. Maybe her maternity leave from her slavery ends. I'm not quite sure, but she can't hide him anymore, and she still can't bring herself to do what she's supposed to do. So she gets close. She reads the letter of the law. You're supposed to put your baby into the Nile water. Okay, I'll do it. But first she made a basket out of reeds. She coated the reeds with tar. She lined the basket with a nice soft cloth. Then she put her baby into the basket. She followed the rules, right? I don't quite know what she was planning, but she floats the basket in the reeds, and she gets her daughter to watch from the shore. I've always wondered what she thought was going to happen. Like, maybe have her 5-year-old daughter watch it from the shore during the day while she's at work, and then carry him back at night and hide him in the house overnight, and then during the day bring him back out and keep going until he's big enough that she could pretend he'd been born before the rules came in place and he was just small for his age. Like what was the plan here? I don't quite know, and I can't think of how it would have worked. So I can only imagine that these are the actions of an incredibly desperate mother, hoping against hope to find some way through an untenable, impossible situation. But somehow, instead, one of Pharaoh's daughters found the basket, found the baby, spotted her daughter, and ended up asking her daughter to find a nurse among the Hebrews who could be a wet nurse for this child. Turns out his mom was free for the job. Who knew? And his mom, his birth mom, then got to raise him until he could come to the palace and be the daughter of the Pharaoh's daughter, or the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. This is how Moses' life started. It seems like a pretty auspicious, pretty amazing start to life, right? But as he grows up in the palace, it seems like maybe everything isn't as rosy as all that. See, he's living the life of an interracial adoptee. He doesn't get to fit quite into either the Egyptian world or the Hebrew world. He really sees this, we really see this in the incident that forces his banishment. When he sees an Egyptian beating on a Hebrew, loses his mind, murders an Egyptian, he just can't take the tension. And he finds out that he was spotted, and so he flees into the desert where he makes friends with the priest and marries one of his daughters and has a family and lives life as a refugee for a while. And like not a short while either here, because it's not until he's 80 and wandering around with his flocks one day that he stumbles across a burning bush that doesn't burn up. He wanders over to investigate it and he hears the voice of God. And I'll go through this next section a little bit faster because Nathan did the basics last week, but he gets given the task of going to speak to Pharaoh, of demanding that Pharaoh free the Israelites. And what I want to notice here is that he's not really convinced about taking this job. Like, here's the scenario, right? There's a bush in front of him, maybe some sagebrush, some sort of thing that you would expect would burn up really fast, right? But it doesn't burn up, it just keeps burning. And he's hearing the voice of God, like directly, like audibly. And he's listening to everything God tells him, and so he does what any of us would do, right? With God telling him the plan, and that he's going to do something important and incredible through Moses to help the Israelites, he does what all of us would do, right? He argues with God. He protests. He refuses. He says that's impossible. 3 times in front of God. Like right there. He says no, and I can't. And God accommodates him in all sorts of ways and gives him all sorts of reassurances. Until finally someone relents. But it's not God. It's Moses. Moses finally relents. That's the one who has to do that. And he sets out to do the job that he's been given. Now, I'll admit, the job isn't an easy one. We talked last week about all the plagues, and some of you will remember that it's Moses who parts the Red Sea, letting the Israelites walk across on dry land, and then covering over the Egyptians with water when they try to follow the Israelites. Some of you will remember from Sunday school that it's Moses who gets the 10 Commandments on the mountain with God, and Moses who breaks the first set of the 10 Commandments when he comes down from the mountain, only to find that his brother, like his second in command, has broken one of the key commandments before the proverbial ink has even dried. It's Moses who gets the tabernacle instructions and the sacrificial systems instructions and the laws for the people of Israel in Leviticus. Moses whose arms have to stay raised up for the people to be victorious in battle. But it's also Moses who gets in a whole heaping pile of trouble for striking a rock with his staff to force water to come out of it for the people. And Moses, who consequently doesn't get to cross the Jordan River to set foot in the Promised Land when all of this is done. And it's this Moses, the one who spends so much time in God's presence, who sees the back of God and hears God's audible voice and meets with God physically and in person, and still fails to trust God when it comes to the incident with the rock. This Moses is the one who's considered to be a man of God. This is going to be important for us. Because this is this man who lived 120 years of life, who didn't meet God until he was 80 and doubted him over and over and over again, despite the most undeniable experiences of God imaginable. This is the one that the psalm we're going to look at today is attributed to. Here's how it starts. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Pretty good so far, right? Sounds like a worship song. Like maybe I should just send Michelle into the back and she can like work that up with a little melody and we can sing it at the end, right? Problem is the next verses. Immediately, without skipping anything, here's what it says next. You turn us back to dust and say, turn back, you mortals. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or like a watch in the night. You sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are consumed by your anger, by your wrath. We are overwhelmed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. For all our days pass away under your wrath. Our years come to an end like a sigh. The days of our life are 70 years, or perhaps 80 if we are strong. Even then, their span is only toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger? Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. So teach us to count our days that we may gain a wise heart. Turn, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. Thank you for coming. This middle section, it's kind of hard to handle, right? This idea of an angry God that Nathan talked about growing up with, this idea of a wrathful and vengeful God, it's one of those things that gets especially connected with the Old Testament. And it's because of passages like this. They make us think of a God who is out to get us, who is actively waiting and looking for a chance to smite us, who knows all of our hidden sins and knows exactly why we don't count and don't measure up and all of those things that we've been taught to think. I think because of the way it's written, because it sort of comes across as a statement of fact, right? And it's written down in words in the Bible, and we have this very correct notion that, the Bible tells us about God. And then it's been taken sometimes and taught in a way that, let's face it, uses wrath as a convenient tool to make people afraid and try to control them. And all of that can make it easy to assume that this psalm, this prayer of a person, or more likely a people, who are struggling with the way life is right now, is a perfectly accurate description of who God is. I think if we think that, we've made a mistake. I think if we think that, we've misread this passage and others like it. Why do I say that? Well, for starters, we just went through the Cole's Notes version of Moses' life, right? This life that should have ended in infanticide, the life of a murderer, the life of a doubting dude who begged God to pick anyone else other than him, who doubted God even when he was speaking with God face to face. And after all of the miracles of the plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptians and the manna and the quail and the water in the wilderness, still disobeyed God. And so if this idea of God as a wrathful, angry God was an accurate description of who God is and how God thinks, then I don't think Moses would have ever become the venerated prophet of 3 major world religions. I don't think Moses would have led the Israelites out of Egypt. I don't think Moses would have lived to 120. In fact, if this was God's character, I think the best Moses could have looked forward to was an average life of 70 or 80 years, lived out in obscurity in the desert, as millions of others have done throughout history. But that's not what happens to Moses, is it? somehow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob chooses a murdering, octogenarian, disabled refugee, the son-in-law of what is presumably a pagan priest, and decides that he should be the one to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, even when he says no. Not only that, God seems to think that it's worth spending time with Moses. Not once or twice, but over and over and over and over again. Moses spends more time talking to some tangible presence of God, I think, than any other character possibly in the Bible. And although he doesn't get to go into the promised land at the end, Moses still leads the people of Israel for 40 years before he dies. There are very few prime ministers or presidents who can make that sort of a claim. So making mistakes doesn't get you smited. Apparently, murdering people doesn't get you smited. Doubting God when God is right in front of you doesn't get you smited, or healed for that matter. So how else could we read this? Well, I think our best option is to read it as a lament. A couple of weeks ago, Nathan led us in a prayer of lament in response to the news of the bodies of hundreds of children being found on the properties of residential schools. In the intervening weeks, hundreds more have been found. I think, from my history degree, that it's safe to say we've only scratched the surface of what will be found eventually. Lament is the response of the people of God to the hard things of life. And the lament of the Old Testament, the lament of this psalm, rather than being an accurate statement about the nature and character of God, serves as permission for us to get angry about what's going on. Think about it with me. I've spent almost 20 years listening to people cry and lament over the loss of those they love. Little tiny babies they never got to meet. Parents they've been estranged from for 30 years, and everything in between. And sometimes when people are grieving, they try to stay very proper and very polite and not say anything mean or upsetting. But if we want to heal, if we want to get to a world where we can get up the next morning and then get up the morning after that and the morning after that, then we need to do more than politely cry or speak a publicly acceptable eulogy or hit share on a Facebook post. We need to lament and mourn. We need to cry great big sobbing tears. We need to get honest about the hurt that has happened. We need to be able to even get angry at God that there is this injustice all around us. The Psalms give us permission to get angry with God. Psalm 90 gives us permission to get angry with God. And the reason we have permission to get angry with God in our laments is the second clue to what is going on in the Old Testament when God gets angry. Because I think that God gets angry because anger is part of lament. I think God gets angry at the injustices of our world, at the unfairness of what goes on around us, at the ways in which people use and abuse and hurt and harm one another. Worryingly enough, as a new preacher preaching on the character of God, I'm pretty sure God gets angry about being misrepresented to people by church leaders who are convinced they know what makes God angry and what doesn't. So I'm going to tread pretty carefully here. And without presuming, I'm going to suggest that part of what this psalm is offering is a model of lament. And as a model of lament, it tells us that it's okay to get really, truly mad, and for some of that anger to be directed at God. God can take it. God has big shoulders. We can tell God about the things that have gone wrong, the injustices we have experienced and those around us have experienced, and the ways in which the world isn't yet the way it was meant to be. Getting mad at God can be an important part of our story. Getting mad at injustice is an important part of what it means to be people of God who lament. And it's such an important part of the story that these Psalms actually call us to lament. They encourage us to cry out to God and get angry about the injustices in our lives, because the expectation of the Psalms is that we will pray them, and we will pray them collectively. That we will, as a group, fully enter into them with all of our own pain and the brokenness of the world around us. Because God laments, lament is part of what we are called to do as people of God. But getting mad at God and injustice also can't be the end of the story. There's this interesting phrase in verses 5 to 7. It says, "You sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are consumed by your anger, by your wrath we are overwhelmed." And it turns out that the words for wrath and fury could be translated hotly burning breath. Some of the commentaries talk about these verses relating to one another, that when it talks about the grass fading and withering in the evening, it's related to this hotly burning breath. If you live in a desert, this idea of a hotly burning breath would make a lot of sense. Hot winds, I'm told by my family members who have been there, blow across the desert in ways that scorch almost everything in their path. If you wanted to wreck someone's day in the desert, sending a hot wind would be a pretty satisfying way to do that. But as I read this verse, I'm reminded of another passage, this time in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is talking to his listeners about what to do with the things they are worried about. And he draws their attention to the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. And he reminds his listeners that God feeds the birds of the air even though they don't grow anything. And he clothes the flowers of the field even though they can't even make their own thread. And he says, "But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith?" Here at Vox, we've always said that it's really important, if we want to be followers of Jesus, that we evaluate everything we say and do, everything we think and understand about God and ourselves and our relationships with one another through the lens of Jesus. And that includes reading the Bible through that lens as well. And so we read this passage in the Psalms, and as we think about whether it tells us that God is a wrathful God or not, we need to look at what Jesus says about the grass that is here today and is gone tomorrow, burnt up in the hot breath of the oven. Because what Jesus says is that how long we are here is not the determining factor for whether God loves us or takes care of us or not. See, from our vantage point, it might look like the grass of the field is nothing, that God doesn't care about it, that God is angry and wrathful towards it because it has a short existence. But Jesus says, you're missing the point. The point is that God made it, that God tended it, that God clothed it and made it beautiful and looked after it and was concerned about it, even for the short length of its life, despite how worthless we might think that it was. So what do we do with all of this? One of the things I noticed as I read through Exodus this week, refreshing the story of Moses in my mind, was that God is what God says when God first shows up in the burning bush to talk to Moses. He says, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them, to bring them up to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And it's this good view of God that we catch in the last part of the psalm. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad as many days as you have afflicted us, and as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be manifest to your servants, and your glorious power to your children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and prosper us the work of our hands. Oh, prosper us the work of our hands. This is what we get after the lament is over. We get this vision of a good God, a God who is steadfast in love, a God who makes us glad, who is manifest or obvious to us, a God who brings good things out of the work that we do. This is the God that we serve. When we have done the work of lamenting the injustice around us, this is the God we need to come back and remember. One of my profs at school, Tom Reynolds, talks about this idea of blaming God for when things go wrong. This idea that if someone is hurting or suffering, that it must be God, it must be because they've done something wrong or their parents did something wrong and God is punishing them. And he says, like, theologically, that just doesn't really work. It doesn't make sense at the end of the day when we try to hold it up with the way the Bible talks about God. Instead, he argues that rather than being a wrathful, vengeful God, the God of the Bible is a God who shows up and gets present with us, even joins in among us in the midst of our lament, and loves on God's people in ways that let them be changed to become more and more the people they were always meant to be. This is the story of Moses. This is the story of the Israelites, slaves and outcasts, refugees, murderers, unfaithful, doubting, whiners. God doesn't smite them. He doesn't obliterate them or even abandon Moses to look for someone better qualified or more interested when Moses says no the first 3 times. He doesn't leave the Israelites to starve to death when they grumble and complain one too many times. Even when the consequences of their actions lead to death, there is always a way out being offered. But the whole time they wander in the wilderness, all 40 years of their time out there, we are told that a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night kept them visually aware of God's presence. We're told that God met regularly with Moses, that Moses heard directly from God and served as the mouthpiece of God to the people. God's response to our failures and the injustices of our world is to get present and to love on God's people. And when the Israelites don't have the message after 3 months, God invests another 40 years wandering with them in the desert so that they have more time with God to get to know God's presence more deeply and in a more tangible, practical, transformational sort of way. In other words, what we find through this psalm and through the life of Moses is not the perfection of Moses as a man of God, not God's anger and vengeance, but God's mercy and grace on the imperfect, doubting, inadequate Moses. That's what makes him a man of God. So, after all that, I want to finish with a few questions. Number one. If Moses is our example of what a man of God looks like, a murdering refugee full of doubt and uncertainty, unwillingness and whining in the face of the awesome, tangible presence of God, is it any more possible that you could also be a person of God? Question number 2. Are there some injustices you need to lament? Stories you've been given about God or about yourself that are untrue or unhelpful, that are tearing you apart and wreaking pain and suffering on your life. Are there perhaps some systemic injustices around you that need to be actively grieved right now? Ways you have participated in these systems that you need to become aware of, get honest about, repent of, or steps you need to take to show up to make things better. Final question. What does it change when we remember that God's presence and God's steadfast love for us is renewed each and every morning? When we look at God not as an angry God, when we look at God not through the angry, lamenting eyes of the psalmist, but through the compassionate eyes of Jesus, who promises that no matter how weak or small or short-lived or even worthless we think we are, God loves us, provides for us, and wants to be present with us to change us, no matter how long it takes us to get the memo. How does that change how we think about God? How does that change how we think about ourselves? How does that change how we act with one another? Let's pray.